Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring ecopsychology and environmental hazards. With me is Dr. Beverly Rubik, who is a biophysicist. She is the president of the Institute for Frontier Science. She is also an adjunct faculty member in integrative health at Saybrook University. And in addition, she is the president of the U.S. Psychotronics Association. Welcome, Beverly.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's my pleasure.
It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to be with an old friend. And we've known each other now for many, many decades.
Yes, since graduate school.
Since graduate school. That's right, at UC Berkeley. And I remember even back then you were doing pioneering work in psychic healing.
Yes. Well, it's been the course of my career following frontier topics in science and medicine.
Yeah. And we're going to start by talking about ecopsychology, which for me means that we have to understand as human beings that we are more than just whatever is inside of our skin.
Yes.
That actually our being, our presence, our consciousness is reflected in the environment itself.
Yes, we tend to think, and we're taught in science, that we're just basically a bag of biomolecules. And that's very limited. Because first of all, there's the flow of energy and matter through us at all times. And every 7 years, we change all the atoms and molecules of our body. Yep. And then we're also energetically connected to the environment. We are electromagnetic beings. We have an energy field, a biofield, and there's a lot of energy now coming from the environment as well as chemicals flowing through us that we should be concerned about. Yeah,
I think we tend to feel like we don't have any responsibility for the environment. Certainly as an individual, the environment is so much bigger than any single person. But we know that as a species, the environment today is vastly different than it was, let's say, even 100 years ago. There
Absolutely.
are hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million new chemicals in the environment that didn't even exist 100,000 or 100 years ago.
That's right. And along with that, we have a plethora of frequencies that humanity and Earth beings never evolved with, and new frequencies are introduced all the time into our wireless communication devices.
Our bodies are being penetrated by microwaves and radio waves all across the electromagnetic spectrum, coming from probably at any given moment 100 different sources.
At least.
And it's increasing all the time. For example, now millions of people have cell phones, and those cell phones are emitting microwaves.
Actually, it's almost 7 billion cell phones in a world of about 7.6 billion people. 7 billion people are being served with cell phones. Even if they don't own them, they're using them. And what really concerns me especially are the children.
Well, let's talk about that because you and I both knew Elizabeth Targ, a wonderful researcher in the field of psychic healing, psychiatrist, excellent researcher, a parapsychologist who died, now it's been well over a decade ago, with a glioblastoma brain tumor. Ironically, she was studying brain tumors at the time of her death, studying glioblastomas. When she contracted the disease, it killed her. And she was a person who, because of her travels and so on, she was on the cell phone, holding it right up to her head, as far as I know, all the time.
Yes. The early days.
Yeah.
And the cell phones were strong emitters, and she was constantly on that phone with her patients as a psychiatrist. She once told me that she thought glioblastoma was the worst cancer you can get. So she had just started a study on glioblastoma and prayer. And I remember asking her, did she think that prayer might extend their lives or cure the cancer? And she said no, but she thought it would give them a better quality of life. Mm-hmm. She had just done the study on HIV, showing how prayer also improves quality of life.
Well, she did double-blind studies, as far as I know, very rigorous, showing that interventions, distant healing interventions even, could have a statistically significant effect.
Exactly. Yes, her studies were very pioneering, showing really the interconnectedness of the human race through conscious intention and prayer to actually heal or promote the health of another being kilometers and miles away.
So if it's possible to affect another biological organism over a great distance simply by the power of human intention or human thought, which is about as subtle a phenomenon as you can find, imagine how much greater the impact must be from the hundreds of thousands of chemicals and hundreds and thousands of electromagnetic frequencies that are penetrating our bodies every day.
Yes, I'm certainly concerned about this. And I think there might be an interrelationship of that pollution in terms of how it affects us. Because the wireless radiations, which are now coming out of all of these communication devices, from cell phone towers to antennas to cell phones to Wi-Fi modems to your computer keyboard without wires.
Yeah, Bluetooth.
Work on opening the blood-brain barrier. And then we're exposed to chemicals that are therefore getting into our brains that were never able to get there before. So it's almost like a 1-2 punch in terms of the effects of both Wi-Fi and electromagnetic pollution and the chemical pollutants.
Now, let's define what the blood-brain barrier is.
Well, the blood-brain barrier is a filtration barrier. Some molecules can get through to the brain if it's intact, but if it's broken or opened, and radiation has that effect, it weakens membranes. It weakens cell membranes, so calcium rushes in. So chemicals that were excluded from the brain are now suddenly pouring in.
I'm under the impression that the blood-brain barrier works primarily to keep certain chemicals out of the brain.
That's correct. Yes. But if you disrupt the barrier, then you unfortunately get chemicals coming in that the body was protected from previously that now can interact with, probably the most important organ that's running the show, heart and brain.
Well, this is one example of how these environmental toxins and radiations and so on affect the body. I know there are hundreds of other examples, but I think the key here is that it's happening slowly. It's not like a tiger jumping out at you from behind a bush that triggers your flight or fight response. We're more like the frogs in a pot of water that is slowly heating up, and we don't notice that it's getting hotter and hotter.
Yes, that experiment with frogs says a lot, because if you were to put living frogs into boiling water, they would hop out. But if you have frogs in a pot where you slowly turn up the heat and they're getting cooked, they don't know they're getting cooked, and they're not going to hop out, and they will die.
And there is a sense in which this is what we're doing to ourselves.
Yes.
With all of these chemicals. And I think we expect that the industry, or the many industries that are involved, will regulate themselves, and that the government has protections to protect the overall health of the population. So, plus what can any single individual do anyways? So most people don't worry about it.
Well, my concern is that, first of all, the government doesn't know very much, and the industry sort of tells the government how to regulate the field. And then they say, okay, sure, because you know more, you're the industry. But the problem is the industry really has different motivations. It wants to make money and sell devices or chemicals. So they don't always have the people's interest in their best
we had the we've been through this once with the tobacco industry, where for decades and decades they knowingly sold at great profit products that were contributing to poor health across a vast array of the population.
Yes, and the wireless radiation from communication devices has been called the new tobacco, except you can't smell it, you can't sense it, it's invisible, and the coming fifth generation, or so-called 5G, you're not able to measure it unless you have very expensive military equipment that costs around $250,000. So who's going to oversee this and assure that we're going to get no more than an acceptable dose?
All right, let's talk about 5G. And I suppose to start, we have to understand, what about 1, 2, 3, and 4? What does the G stand for?
The G is generation.
Uh-huh.
So we went from getting broadband to Wi-Fi and cell phones and then smartphones. And now we're moving up to the fifth generation. Mm-hmm. And that will empower the so-called Internet of Things. It'll be much more widespread network where virtually everything you own, every appliance, and maybe even other things, will be beeping digital signals of radio frequency millimeter waves up to antennas that gather information about your usage. And in addition to that Internet of Things, then we have the coming self-driving cars, which will also operate. They need a very fast bandwidth, and hence the 5G is required. We can't have them on the present generation.
Mm-hmm. So the bandwidth of 5G is different than the bandwidth that we're using currently in the fourth generation 4G.
That's right. It's higher bandwidth because the wavelength is tinier and it can carry more information.
Mm-hmm. So in effect, that enables, a vast multiplication of signals, like from every appliance in your house, eventually.
Exactly. And with the plan to put 20,000 satellites into the lower Earth orbit to deliver these frequencies on top of various so-called small cell antennas that will be installed every 200 to 1,000 feet in our neighborhoods, near our schools and places of worship, we're going to be inundated with these frequencies. There's no place to go to be Wi-Fi free.
Well, on the positive side, for a moment, it seems to me that this development is like we are almost at an unconscious level creating I'm going to call it a global brain. We're wiring up. It's like all of these electromagnetic connections are like the neurons of the global brain, so to speak, wired and wireless. And the potential is, for a whole new form of consciousness to emerge. Maybe the planet itself will develop a personality, so to speak.
That reminds me of Willis Harman. I think he wrote such a book on the global mind change.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, who's going to be controlling this information? We have to ask ourselves. I think it's largely the wireless telecom companies, and they may be selling a lot of this information to advertisers, telling them about how you consume, what you use, when, etc. And I feel that's an invasion of privacy, for one, besides the concern over health and environmental consequences of this huge increase in the wireless frequencies and the wavelength, the higher frequency being probably more deleterious to life on Earth. We don't really know, we're guinea pigs here. How is that going to affect the bees, the birds, our pets, the plants? There already was an experiment in the Netherlands where they turned on a couple of cell phone towers and delivered 5G frequencies and found many birds suddenly died and were just found on the ground.
In fact, didn't you tell me it was thousands?
Thousands of birds fell to their deaths. And of course, some people say, well, maybe they suddenly got a disease, but it seems a coincidence then that they turn on these 5G towers, they're just starting up, pilot testing, and the birds all suddenly drop out of the sky? My goodness, this sounds very environmentally dangerous.
Well, Wouldn't you say, though, that there's an enormous push to let this happen? I mean, people think of this as progress, 5G. We're going to be able to do so much more. We'll have driverless cars. We'll have all of your appliances integrated into a smart system. You can lock your doors when you're away from home if you like.
And I hear this from people. They want the latest and greatest technology, and they say, what are you worried about? What has 4G or 3G or 2G done to you? But 5G is really different. Mm-hmm. And then we also have the increase in electro sensitivity. There's a small number of people that really have symptoms when they come near these appliances, mm-hmm. the wireless appliances in
most
particular.
People do not.
Most people don't, but actually then there was an experiment where they put some metal helmets on people who say, I don't have a problem with this. And after they did that in the presence of Wi-Fi, they had better memory. They could recall things. I mean, many people slowly have erosion of concentration and memory issues mm-hmm. that may be attributable to these technologies, but we don't know anymore because it's very hard to enter a place where it's wireless free. So mm-hmm. how can we do that experiment except by putting on a shroud over our heads? I hate to say it, not a tinfoil hat.
But the metal helmets, in effect, shield radiation from entering into the cranium.
Yes, metal mesh or solid metal mm-hmm. Helmets, and then often grounded.
Yeah.
And clothing like this as well. These poor electrosensitive people have to wear special outfits or paint their homes with special paint that act as Faraday cages to keep these waves mm-hmm. out.
So if you're inside of a Faraday cage, which is actually fairly simple to construct, you're shielded from environmental radiation.
Yes, unless you've got something going on in your house, of course.
Something inside the cage itself.
Your computer, your wireless keyboard or something.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are ways that people can protect themselves, but now I want to talk about something that's very important. You showed me earlier that I think it was during the Clinton administration, a law was passed by Congress that local communities, when they assess whether or not to put up cell towers, are not allowed to take into consideration the environmental impact on health. They
That's
can only
correct.
look at the aesthetic impact of putting up cell towers in particular locations, not the health impact.
That was a law passed by federal Congress in 1996 and signed into law by Clinton. Exactly. And then we had a ruling by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, which kind of oversees the wireless telecoms, in September 2018, that said we're on a fast track. Once again, local communities aren't in control of this. It's the federal government controlling the rollout of this fifth generation, this 5G. So, and local governments are quite upset about this. Some of them feel their jurisdiction has been taken away and that they can't discuss and consider the health and welfare of their populations. Seems incredible. Seems to me like the federal government's overstepping local government jurisdiction here.
And you've been an activist in this in your own community in Oakland.
Yes, I have. I tried to talk about health and environmental effects to the Oakland City Council and to the Oakland Planning Commission, only to hear that they have no jurisdiction. So no point addressing this issue, that we can only talk about aesthetics of the antennas, the appearance, the color, the shape, as well as a little bit about placement. But ultimately, the placement is going to be determined by the industry, who has to put a blanket of these antennas in order to give coverage everywhere. So we only have a little say in that as well. It was very disappointing.
And if I understand you correctly, even the Environmental Protection Agency has been taken out of the circle of supervision of this rollout.
Yes, the EPA was kind of removed from its jurisdiction of looking at health and welfare with this 1996 legislation by the federal government. Mm-hmm. So they're out of the picture. Now it's just between the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, and the industry. And I would say they seem in cahoots with one another, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because first of all, the FCC doesn't really know anything about health and the environment. They only know about divvying up the spectrum and handing out frequencies, taking frequencies from the military, from what was military radar, and now giving that to civilian telecom industry to make our wireless technology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's going on. They're no longer concerned, it seems, about health and the environment.
And I gather that the one of the reasons they're not particularly concerned is because they've done studies that show, for example, that these microwaves that are penetrating our bodies are not heating up our brains. We are not frying our brains.
The so-called thermal effects or the heating of tissue is the only thing they're concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
But there are literally thousands of studies, not only done here in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, published in peer-reviewed journals showing so-called non-thermal effects, which means there's a host of other things, changes going on. As I said, the cell membranes lose their integrity. They can open up and all kinds of effects can happen, from the level of DNA and gene expression to biochemical changes to behavioral and performance in humans. It's just every level of order and organization and living systems are affected.
Yeah. Well, you know, I did an interview with one of our colleagues back from graduate school days, Kenneth Pelletier, recently on epigenetics. And it's so exciting, the possibility that we can actually control the expression of our genes consciously through diet, exercise, and even our mental attitude. That's the positive side. But the negative side is that all of these contaminants, both electromagnetic and chemical, that are entering our environment are also having an impact on our epigenetics.
That's right. So how can we really control that? It seems as though on the one hand we have some control through the mind-body, but on the other hand there's all this stuff out there, a barrage of chemicals from the environment, pesticides, herbicides, agrochemicals, excess pharmaceutical drugs that get flushed down the toilet, unfortunately, and then end up in our water supply at low levels. And all of these things are impacting us, and we have no clue what is going to become of that epigenetic control.
Now, I know Ken was very concerned about glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, the weed killer. He pointed to a new research study that showed that plankton in Antarctica and in the oceans of Antarctica now show evidence of glyphosate, that it's penetrated the environment that far.
That's right.
And I gather that antibiotics that people routinely take, and then if they expire, they flush them down the toilet. Our water supply is full of antibiotics.
It is. Glyphosate, there was a paper in Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a very prestigious journal, showing that the urine of adults, just about everybody, even eating good diets, is also glyphosate-ridden. Glyphosate is not only used in farming to kill weeds, it's used to dry wheat. Apparently it's a drying agent. So then you get wheat especially high in glyphosate. And I think this is one of the reasons people are stopping eating gluten and moving toward gluten-free diets, because of glyphosate and the effects on the integrity of their digestive systems. One of the things glyphosate does to our cells is it weakens the cell junctions. So with that, you get a hyperpermeable intestine, and then you start getting food sensitivities, not just to gluten, but a lot of things. And so people find they get food allergies or food sensitivities that they didn't even have in their youth. You know, there's a small number of people that have a gene that produces something called celiac disease, but they would know by the time they're youngsters that they have to avoid gluten. But now you see gluten all over the place. gluten-free diets that people are turning to because they're having problems.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I understand that one of the reasons that gluten has become such a problem is that the wheat that we now use in processed flour isn't the same wheat that people were eating generations ago because of genetic modification.
Yes, and all of the common vegetables and fruits have been genetically modified. I'm thinking potatoes, wheat, strawberries, oranges, some of the common ones that I remember. Mm-hmm. But they've moved up and they're genetically modifying salmon. Now, that salmon is going to get out of these fish farms, surely at some point, into the wild. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen to the wild type? And it's one thing to sell seeds and have farms just localize these genetically modified foods. And it's another thing when things get out into the environment. Yeah. And then we lose the God-given wild type.
Well, I think it's fair to say that while all of this is going on, 50,000 new chemicals put into the environment every year, all kinds of new forms of electromagnetic signaling penetrating our bodies all day long, every day. At the same time, we are living through what some people call the sixth extinction. That is the sixth major extinction of life since the Earth was formed 4 billion years ago.
And yes, we seem to be producing these extinctions, mm-hmm. but there's a small amount of, I would say, global climate change as well. Yeah. And it's hard to say how much do we contribute to that.
Well, we can't know. I mean, this is well beyond the science of our day to try and integrate the interaction between climate change and tens of thousands of new chemicals and electromagnetic radiation and pollution and all the other social changes that are going on. I suppose it's useful to say that there are a few hopeful signs.
Surely, yes. Well, I think I did a research project that I'd like to speak about.
Okay.
I studied an app for a cell phone that had a particular frequency or maybe a group of frequencies. It was proprietary technology. Mm-hmm. I didn't know. But I did this study.
It was like a black box.
Yes, a black box. It was a cell phone. I had 2 cell phones identical, mm-hmm. just with numbers A and B. Yeah. And people were exposed to them not by using them, but the cell phone was put within a meter or a yard of the body while they read a book. Mm-hmm. And I simply measured heart rate variability initially when they came in, and after 30 minutes of being exposed to this app, mm-hmm. which ran passively on the phone. It was not an active app. Mm-hmm. They didn't have to interact with it. They didn't have to touch the phone. And what I found was improvements in the physiology. The heart rate variability improved, which has to do with their resilience and resistance to stress. Mm-hmm. And they just ran a passive app in the background of a cell phone a short distance from the body.
And you had a control group. I had
a control. I had 2 mm-hmm. phones. I didn't know which one had the real app. They looked the same. Yeah. There was one sham app that looks the same, but the frequencies were not being emitted. Uh-huh. So what I found was that apparently you can introduce a beneficial frequency onto a wireless communication device that can actually improve your health. That gives me great hope that if we really understood what are the positive frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum that might positively impact the biofield in our flesh and blood, that we could actually strengthen our health and maybe strengthen the health of beings, the plants and animals as well. And yet we don't know enough to do that at this mm-hmm. point. So this is just one case. It's proprietary technology, and it showed some positive results. To me, it's the first study that shows the influence of a beneficial frequency added to a wireless device. And so with that, I feel there's great hope. What if we could revision these wireless technology devices to utilize or at least include beneficial frequencies to our health and other beings, plants, animals, etc. It seems to me if we understood more about the human energy field, the biofield, mm-hmm. and the fields of other animals and plants, we could create really healthful, beneficial technology.
Well, I assume that to really engage in the hundreds of studies that would be necessary to build up a database to do what you're proposing. We have to develop a whole new culture around science.
Yes, we do. But we had, for example, the Human Genome Project, which was a multi-billion-dollar project, involved scientists on all the continents. And we did reveal that we have, the human genome is composed of something like 20,000 genes, but unfortunately it's less genes than a grain of rice. It wasn't very enlightening. So we know it's not all there. But there's more to it. But we could have a human energy project or a biofield mapping project. We spent the money on the human genome. Now let's look at the wave-like nature of life. And let's learn that phase of it.
That would be very hopeful, but I'm under the impression that the Human Genome Project was a success to the extent that it was a success because it comported with the reductionist, materialistic notion that if we could only understand the gene, then we will have solved the whole mystery of health and disease and longevity and athletic strength, et cetera, et cetera. I gather from my discussions with our mutual friend Ken Pelletier, that after all was said and done, they found that the genome doesn't matter nearly as much as was once thought.
That's right. I remember that great promise of molecular biology that, understand the parts, you'll understand the whole. But life is much more complicated, and there's no one model. I've proposed an energy model of life. There's even experiments done by the Nobel Prize winner Luc Montagnier. He got the Nobel Prize for HIV, co-shared with Gallo at our National Institutes of Health. And then he went on to study what happens when you dilute DNA and make homeopathic-like solutions, and showed that the information of DNA is still contained in a wave-like form. Amazing.
Yes, the memory of water.
The memory of water, following in the footsteps of Jacques Benveniste and others. And Luc Montagnier shows that very complex genomes, even of a virus, could be seen as a wave by the molecules. So I would say the human being, on the one hand, is like a crystal, a structural crystal. On the other hand, is like a dancing flame of energy. We have both models. In fact, we have the same model in physics to describe light. We have the photon on the one hand is a particle. On the other hand, it's a wave. So we have to look at the wave-like nature of life now.
Now you're reminding me of, I think it's an old Ray Bradbury novel, I Sing the Body Electric.
Yes, exactly. The Body Electric, it was a book by Robert Becker, a very famous book, actually. And he was quite a pioneer. I think he would roll over in his grave today. He was worried about 60 hertz, the power line frequency, and how that was linked to cancer. And they showed childhood leukemia, brain cancer, also when power lines were too close to schools and homes. But today, we have the Wi-Fi and the increasing generations where they don't remove the first, second, third, fourth generation. They're adding more. And they're now talking about 6G. They haven't even rolled out 5G.
Well, there's been some opposition. I think you explained to me that some countries have decided not to implement 5G at all.
Certain countries or parts of countries have said, we don't know that it's safe. You must show us first that it's safe. For example, Brussels, capital of the European Union, parts of Rome, parts of Switzerland, and other countries, even, I understand, parts of Florida have put a moratorium on the 5G rollout to the extent that they can. I don't know the rulings in all of those countries. But there's a growing number of scientists and medical doctors that have signed petitions that we can't go through with this just yet. Hold on. We need studies done by third parties, not the industry, to show that this is safe before we blanket the earth with all of these new frequencies.
Well, as a parapsychologist, I am very interested, of course, in what environmental factors might be conducive to increasing our extrasensory perception or psi abilities. And I can't help but think of the old studies going back to the 1950s with Andrea Puharich, replicated by my friend Charlie Tart, using the Faraday cage that we talked about earlier, placing research subjects inside of a shielded cage, and he noted that whether it was grounded or ungrounded made a difference in his studies. But it seemed as if putting someone in the Faraday cage would enhance extrasensory perception, which suggests to me that these very, very subtle environmental noises that could, from an electromagnetic nature and, for all I know, a chemical nature, as well, interfere with our God-given capacity for extrasensory and spiritual perceptions.
It makes good sense to me. And also the Ganzfeld, the restriction of sensorium, neutral field, or maybe darkness, enhancing psi.
Yeah, the Yoga Sutras say you quiet the mind, and then the quiet mind is like the surface of a still, calm lake that reflects the environment perfectly. And to the extent that our environment is full of all of these new forms of noise and pollutants, it affects, I think, the ability of the masses of people to concentrate. And not just concentrate. You pointed out to me there is a whole rash of new diseases that are endemic now in the population that we never used to have. Things like autism, for example.
Yes, we had, I think, one case in 10,000 people of autism when you and I were young, and today it's on the order of 3 to 5 and 100 births in this country. And it's just abominable because it's such a horrific disease that we don't understand all the factors. But I think that the wireless exposure to children in utero, fetus in utero, mothers sometimes are putting tablets on their abdomen or cell phones nearby the developing fetus, and then also handing a cell phone to a young child like a pacifier. And baby monitors are running with Wi-Fi. You can get a wired one, but the common ones are wireless. The potty trainers even have Wi-Fi and a screen. You're learning to multitask from age 2.
So one of your recommendations for people is to eliminate Wi-Fi, go back to Category 5 cables and wired technology.
Yes, to the extent that we can. For example, I can operate just fine with Internet DSL, Ethernet DSL, the old plug-in. And by the way, it's more secure. You don't risk breaches of security as you do with Wi-Fi. Someone driving by can hack into your system, take your banking numbers. But we don't have that problem with wired, and we somehow forgot that. I think there's almost an infatuation with wireless. They're making stuff with wireless that we don't need. I mean, when I have a workstation at home, I don't need a wireless
keyboard,
mouse or keyboard, and yet they come this way. And, you know, there's a lot of radiation coming from that. I was having some heart palpitations, and then I realized, my gosh, I've got a wireless keyboard. Let me get an old wired keyboard and an old wired mouse. And presto, I didn't have any more heart palpitations.
Because people, many professionals such as yourself, will sit at the keyboard for hours at a time.
It was after many hours I felt this, and I didn't know why. And installing the old wired form was just perfect. So, of course, I have a cell phone. We all need them practically to function in today's world. But I would say prudent avoidance. That means I put my cell phone on airplane mode most of the time when I'm not using it. And if I expect a call or need to see if someone called or texted, I turn it on for a moment, and then at the touch of a button, airplane mode. And you can feel safe to put it on the body when it's in airplane mode because there's no emission. But if it's turned off or put on some other mode, it's always talking to antennas and cell phone towers, and you're getting blasted.
And we're talking microwave radiation, which is the same stuff that we use in a microwave oven.
Yes, it's of the same order. Some of the frequencies are even close to that which heat water. And after all, we're 70% water. That's life. So, yes, indeed. So, prudent avoidance. I think you can also opt out of the smart meter if you haven't had one installed, or even if you had, there's ways to do that.
The electric meter.
The electric meter, which is digital versus the old analog one, which was safer. So when anything becomes digital, we have to be concerned that that it involves Wi-Fi, because it's going to feed into this Internet of Things, which is the 5G that's coming.
And you pointed out that the digital Wi-Fi spikes, the electromagnetic spikes, are different than an analog signal. The body has a harder time, in fact, doesn't ever adapt to them.
Exactly. You know, we're analog beings, and so is the world, the natural world. And then man-made technology is operating on digital pulses, which are very big, sharp spikes and then followed by silence and another big sharp spike, or maybe a train of them, and then nothing for a while. Now it's like me standing at the light switch and turning it on and off in a random way and saying, can you adapt to this? This kind of lighting where I grab the light switch and turn it on and off in a random way? No living being can adapt to digital type signals that you can't see in this case. But I'm just giving an analogy with the light switch.
Well, I guess for individuals who are endeavoring to be conscious about how they live, for people who watch their diet, for people who exercise, for people who try not to leave too big a footprint in the environment. There's a whole range of things like this to consider about how to shelter ourselves from the potential destructive effects, insidious because they're invisible and they're very subtle and slow. It may take years for the effects to build up, but they're all around us.
That's right. We're really the guinea pigs here. We don't know the effects of all these chemicals that are constantly put into the environment at the whims of corporations that are interested in making money and selling product, but nobody's orchestrating the greater whole here. Nobody's looking at the effects of all of these things collectively, or the future. So we're really guinea pigs for all these exposures, and it really disturbs me that our government and other forces have not taken the reins into their hands and saying, just a minute now, what are the long-term consequences? And our health and welfare should come first of the whole, and not just corporate profits and greed, which seem to be at the bottom line in many ways these days. Yeah.
Well, I know there was a time, and I remember it, before there were really health food stores in every city.
Yes.
Now we have health food supermarkets, but it was in large degree, I think, a response to people pointing out that we were flooding the environment with pesticides. Rachel Carson's book, for example, The Silent Spring, was a real eye-opener for people. And as a result of that, anybody can now buy organic food.
That's true. But on the other hand, the organic farms have become very large. And the quality of that organic, even though it may be free of pesticides and herbicides, the soils are bankrupt. You know, I know a little bit about this because I'm an urban farmer, and I grow things like spinach and raise chickens for eggs.
You grow your own?
I do. And let me tell you something. My spinach is so dark green, I can't find that anywhere at a farmer's market. I have a small patch of spinach, very carefully manicured, the soils carefully treated with rock dust and amendments that go far beyond conventional organic farming. And I'm producing produce that has amazing flavor and nutrition. But I don't see that happening much on the organic farming level that you can find at farmers markets or in the health food supermarkets. So I'm still concerned about our nutrition not being quite up to snuff.
As well you should be. But it seems to me that when we're talking about this new form of electromagnetic pollution that we're on the brink of with the 5G rollout, that we're in the same position as people were before Rachel Carson even wrote her book, The Silent Spring, that people are not yet awake to the dangers.
You're right. And that book came out, 40, 50 years ago?
I think it was 1964 or something like that.
Yes, the 60s. And look, it's 50 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. And we still haven't assimilated that information and made nourishing change based on what we know about chemicals. In fact, we're just cranking out more and more.
More and more.
And part of that rat race is you can only patent chemicals, and then your patents last so long, and then you need to patent new chemicals. It's the way, unfortunately, at least in the United States, the way we've designed intellectual property over these things, and the denigration of nature that has resulted from the worship of profits and the new chemicals and the pipeline of these patentable things, and then the denigration of nature because you cannot patent the natural methods, the natural herbs or supplements or natural agrochemical methods.
Yeah. So it seems to me that what's really required is a cultural shift.
Yes, we need a total shift of consciousness. And we need, first of all, public education on these things. And I feel that this is not entering our conventional educational curricula anymore, as I'm involved in education. And even at maverick schools like Saybrook, most people don't know these things. They just assume if it's out there, the FDA, the FCC, the government agencies have shown it's safe, and I don't have to worry, and I can do all of this. But of course, we also had tobacco, and we now know that's connected with cancer, particularly lung emphysema, lots of lung disorders. And now people have totally curtailed their smoking. So we've had one success. But there's so much more that can be done.
It was a very hard-fought success, and I remember it wasn't so long ago when a major presidential candidate was arguing that tobacco is safe.
Yes, exactly. Because of the industry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there's this, it's something about our economic system and the incentives that it provides that, it's nice that we have a booming economy. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't be having this television, or video series right now. So there are many good things to be said about it, but it also incentivizes people to put profits ahead of people.
I'm reminded of Francis Bacon, who was the father of the scientific method, and he wrote, nature, we need to tease and torture the secrets out of nature. That was the essence of science, and in a way we've done this. And it's to our detriment, really, because of the paradigm that we followed to really dice up nature into pieces, understand the bits, but we have no clue of how the whole works together.
And the great error of Francis Bacon's thinking, and he was a great thinker, and in fact an esoteric thinker as well. There's many positive things to be said about Bacon, but when we torture nature, we have to realize we're torturing ourselves.
Yes, because we're part of nature. You can't separate us from the environment. And you can't separate it chemically. You can't separate it in terms of fields. It's all running together. Matter and energy are flowing through us all of the time. And so these chemicals and these waves are impacting us. And I would say people are becoming at the limit. It's like the rain barrel concept of stress. It can fill up and you can take just so much, but then add a few drops more and you get an overflow. You get a breakdown. You get a disease. We're at that limit. We're seeing these new diseases and disorders, and we have got to wake up and put our foot down and say, enough is enough. Now we need to move to gentler, softer ways of running our technologies, doing farming, doing medicine, so that we don't have all of this pollution at all levels impacting us.
It's the urgent and fundamental message of ecopsychology.
Yes.
Dr. Beverly Rubik, this has been an eye-opener for me. It's not one of the happiest interviews I've ever done by a long shot, but I think it's important that people are aware of these subtle effects that are penetrating every cell of our body.
Absolutely. Let's make change. Let's make nourishing change. We don't scare to scare people. We scare because we care. And my message is we need to educate people. They need to make conscious choices. They need to take back their governments so that we can build a healthy world again, because we may not make it as a species. And there's a lot of concern about that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just one thing anymore. It's so many things together that are impacting our environment, our health. And if we don't do this, I think we're doomed. So let's get the word out.
Dr. Beverly Rubik, thank you for being with me.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's been my pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.